All right. Hi. Welcome, Lainey. We're really excited to have you here today. And I think you're into so many different things. I'm not entirely sure where to start. Maybe you could sort of give us like your origin story, like how you got into homeschooling and world schooling and all that whole scene.
Yeah, I mean, I got into all this by accident, which is really funny. But I'll give you just a really brief origin story to place some context around these topics that we're going to talk about. So I guess we can move back to 2008. I'm originally from California, Los Angeles. And in 2008, we experienced an economy crash in California. At the
Mhm.
time, I was a business owner. I ran a marketing, branding, advertising boutique agency in Los Angeles, had worked in advertising for almost 18 years. And for the entire life of my child, I had been a single parent. At the time, my son, Miro, was 9 years old. And as the year was coming to a close in 2008, I knew I was not bringing my staff back. So I had a small boutique agency that really, I was overworked, and all of the pressures of being a single parent and living the quote unquote American dream, it was challenging, but I was doing it for the reasons of providing the best life I could for my child. And, it was only me and it was up to me and I had to do this thing. But what I was realizing was I was missing out on his childhood. And at 9 years old, my son had said to me almost every night, "Mom, you're always working. You never spend any time with me." And that like put this fissure crack through my
Mm.
heart. And so there was this cognitive dissonance. I knew I was doing it for a purpose. I didn't know how to bring the two parts of my desire together. But when I knew that I wasn't bringing my staff back at the end of 2008 because my clients were going away left and right, one night it was like way too late for a 9-year-old. He was still in the office with me. It was like 9, 10 p.m. And I turned around and I looked at him and I said, "Miro, what do you think if we just get rid of all this stuff and go have an adventure?" And he was playing a video game at one of the computer terminals. And the thing that came out of my mouth was an inspired thought. Like I didn't plan on this. It wasn't this, long series of research. It just was an inspired thought. And he stopped his video game. I remember he was on a swivel chair. He turned around and he looked at me. He's like, "Are you serious?" I was like, "Yeah, what do you think? We'll go have an adventure. Let's go travel." And he's like, "Okay, one question." I was like, "What?" He's like, "Do I have to go to school?" And I was like, "No, no." And intuitively, I knew that, travel would be way more educational. And as somebody who's living a conventional life, 1 year seems like this massive amount of time. So I said, "Yeah, let's go do it for a year." Like that is like forever in the mind of somebody who's living a very conventional life. And 1 year he was looking at fifth grade. I was like, "Of course, no school. Let's go experience the world. Let's go have an adventure. And it's going to be the two of us. And I could live those things that I've always wanted for our relationship, for, being a mom and all that stuff." So we set out for what was to be a 1 year journey. That was almost 15 years ago. We never went back, and now my son's about ready to turn 25. So I've got stories and adventures and so much to tell you. So, yeah, where do you wanna go from there?
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, I have so many different questions right now.
Right.
Uh, my wife and I were contemplating the same thing. My daughter is 16, my son is 10. And I was
Yeah.
like, man, after COVID, I could work from anywhere now. This idea
Yeah.
of, and we share a similar path. I owned an agency for 12 years. And same thing, get up, you run an agency, and at some point I was like, I got to get out of this rat race. And now I'm in a new rat race. It doesn't have all that ecosystem of the agency and the pitches and all this stuff, but you're still sort of living in the same place, sort of doing some work, and then kids come home from school, we eat, Netflix, chill, they go back to bed. And I was like, I still only get like 2-3 hours, and that's it. And my daughter's 16, gonna be 18 soon, and she's gonna figure out her own adventure. So I'm like, I have 2 years left with her, and like 8 years. So we're like, we gotta pack up and go. But to your point, the rational brain is like, wait, but like, you have a house, you got a mortgage, you got car payments, what are you gonna do with the cars, what happened to all these things? And like the cement block that is today's life just is so grounding, it's so heavy that like I don't have a big enough hammer to break this block.
You do. And that is trusting whatever's inside of you. You can call it intuition, spirit, whatever you want to call it. I knew like I was going to take my next breath. Oh gosh, there goes my phone. That we were going to do this and it was going to happen. And this was the right thing. As soon as my son said yes, let me just get this annoying ring music off. Do you guys hear it?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It's all good. This is live TV at its best.
Yes. There you go. So that inner knowing and trusting it. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? If you as in partnership, meaning yourself and your children, and partnership doesn't have to be two people, it can be the entire family culture, the family unit. If you know that this is something that you want, then you've got to figure out a way to make that happen. And that inner knowing will feed off of each other. Each person will add a little bit to it, but it's getting to that place of that knowing. And a lot of it has to do with mindset, right? It has to do with the trust and the belief that this is something that you can do. It took us I'd say about 8 months into our groove we call in the home ed world, we use the term deschooling to sort of let the belief systems that we've had ingrained to us from culture, from our own experiences, from the world around us, sort of float away. It took about that long for us. So for us, coming from a place of working in marketing and advertising, I had this deep cognitive dissonance. And that was, I'm putting this toxicity into the world where I am consciously changing people's belief system to believe that there was some deficit or some scarcity inside of them in order to sell my clients' products or to position them in such a way where their products or services would be desired. So knowing that felt really bad to me. And in our home life, Miro and I used to always talk about media literacy and how to value things. And even though I'm talking about these things, I didn't value the time because I didn't have the time. And just nothing meshed up. And if somebody or you are feeling that familiar kind of discongruent desires in your life, it's not going to go away. You gotta face it. It's going to get better. And when we traded in our lifestyle, like this, what I earned in 1 month ended up being what we started living off for 1 year. And consciously decided that we were going to restructure our relationship to consumerism. And that was part of our family culture. That was the two of us. And this was meaningful for us. And it didn't have to be forever. Nothing has to be forever. And that experiment felt in alignment for what both of us wanted on our journey. And if you can find that space of alignment in each and every person's family, that can be the guide to make changes that are uncomfortable or against the grain. So hopefully
I love that. No, I love that. I love that.
So, how did you decide what to do about schooling and what brought you to that, like, schooling place?
Well, I've been asked this question many, many times. I didn't actually make a decision to unschool or to world school or to do anything that I knew of in terms of, having knowledge of what that thing was. I just knew intuitively that a year of travel would be more educational and it would help us heal the wounds between our separation and not having time. It would allow us to be present, which is the one thing I intellectually knew but didn't have that experience of. It all of those things were part of our decision making, and the idea that we were going off on this grand adventure together felt really good. A grand adventure is really about, the partnership of being present in our own lives, and that you can put a price on that. The education portion, so I looked at what Miro would be learning in fifth grade in traditional school or conventional school in California. He'd be learning about the Spanish missions in California. And I was like, we're going through Latin America. We've got this desire to start in Mexico and head south, end up in Ushuaia, Argentina. And that's a lot of places where we can do a lot of experiential learning together. And it's going to be fun and joyful and all of these other things. So why do we have to be, why do you have to study the Spanish missions in fifth grade when we're going to be living in Latin America, guided by our own inspiration and curiosity? So great. I told you 8 months. We finally kind of got into our groove. We developed our own family culture that was outside of the conventional norm. Part of that, and I am a self-proclaimed anarchist, which in many people's mind, anarchy means chaos, and that's not the definition of the word. Sorry. It simply means living without rulers. And live without a ruler, then I am going to choose to live in partnership with my child. And this goes into whole parenting philosophy. And we are going to live without rules. And most people are now like, I'm turning this podcast off. This is crazy. Who's this crazy woman? Well, we lived without rules because we decided to use the tools that I learned in branding and advertising, and really taught my son and went inside with myself and really defined what our core values were. And that got us close to core values and principles. And when he figured out what his core values were, we were able to craft together as a guiding tool our principles, which guided our decisions, which meant nobody was our ruler, but our core values and our principles guided our decisions. So living in alignment with those things allowed us to live without rules. And one of them was living and learning and fostering our natural curiosity and playing and not having the boundaries of you must or you should. And those are the things that usually break down relationships. Well, you should have done this, or you need to do that, or the expectation of that, which leads into agendas. And that is really, really difficult for a relationship. So reframing how we were walking through the planet, reframing the nature of our relationship, and using the world as this magical place to learn everything. And we were learning together. I stepped back into being a natural learner, and I forgot how much I loved learning. I was in my 40s when we started our journey, and I forgot that I had a deep love of learning that, it was left somewhere in my childhood, but naturally I was one of those learners that loved to learn until school got a hold of me. And so
Ah,
that for my son either. So, how do we decide what method of education? We decided to be learners and to be curious and to have an adventure. And
right,
that framed our learning. And trust me, the learning was deep and rich, and it brought us in different paths. And learning in partnership gave us the great benefit of, you know what? I'm really interested in this pre-Columbian history, which I never knew even existed. Like,
mm,
is that? And Miro started learning about things that he had no idea he had an interest in, like origin stories and myth. And that took him down these pathways and reading these magical texts that were he would have never been exposed to. So
right,
it ignited his real deep love
yeah,
of. And then I'm just going to wrap this whole sort of segment up with, I said about 8 months into our travels, we really got into our own groove. And because one of our core values was to really say yes to life, yes to opportunities, yes to ideas. And it became a game between the two of us. Like, let's check it in first, see if this is in alignment with our core values and our principles. But yes, let's go, left instead of right, or stay instead of go, or consider taking a class instead of whatever. Right? Let's
yeah.
say yes to this invitation. Yes. And when he said to me 8 months into our travels, can we do this forever? I
No.
had to say yes. So
Um,
that also a turning point. And I had to figure out how to make this work from a quote unquote um, responsible parent perspective. And that meant being accountable for my child's education,
Right.
right? Because I wanted him to be educated.
mhm.
So that's when I discovered there was a thing called unschooling. And
Mm,
doing it. And I dove deep into the whole world of unschooling, just so I could learn about it from a philosophical perspective. And I read and went deep and we talked about it, and all the things were totally in alignment with what we were already doing. The only thing that I didn't like about the term unschooling is it said what we were not doing. Therefore,
mm.
I changed the word from un to world, and that felt more in alignment with the journey that we had just begun. So 15 years later, we're world schoolers, but you can call it whatever you want. As an anarchist, you are entitled to use whatever terminology or live whatever
Yeah.
is meaningful to you, as long as it doesn't interfere with my life and vice versa. So yeah, it's about consent and mutual respect.
Man, you've got such great energy when you talk about the journey you've been on, and it's infectious. I do want to move on to teenagers because I've got one, and it's a whole different world. I need a passport to get to know her world. It's crazy. But you've got a book. You've got a book out, Seen, Heard, and Understood: Parenting
Yeah.
and Partnering with Teens. Right? When did this? Uh,
Look, it's right here.
there you go. We're gonna put a thumbnail up, but thank you for flashing it. Talk to us a little bit about the origins around that book and teenagers as an interest for you. And mental health is obviously very serious.
Yeah.
But when I look at Lindsay's kids and my kids, homeschool versus public school, they both have the same love of technology, and they're
You know,
both equally glued to the social spaces, and those spaces tend to be parent first before we get to be parents. So I would love for you to talk about the book, what motivated you to write it, and maybe some key bullet points that parents need to take away before they buy the book.
sure. Well, my whole mental health journey started, really the origin is from my childhood. And as somebody who grew up with trauma and in a household where, I never felt seen, heard, or understood, I knew how important that was. I spent a good part of my early adult, years being in relationships that were not very successful. I had a disorganized attachment style. If you know anything about attachment theory, I would bring people in and then I'd push them away and bring them in, push them away, and it just got tiring for my partners, and it was very unhealthy. And there were a lot of unhealthy patterns that came from my early childhood and then expressed in my adolescence, which was really the most difficult journey in my entire lifetime. The adolescence really, it was filled with a lot of really bad decision making, a lot of self-loathing, a lot of very limiting thoughts. And I knew as a result of reflecting in my 30s that not only my relationships were a reflection of my beliefs about myself, but I had some cleaning up to do with the trauma that I had from my early childhood. And Miro was born when I was 32 or 33, around there. And so I knew that I always wanted to be a parent, but I didn't want to parent the way that I was parented. And that drove me into this deep, line of discovery and research. And as somebody who had trauma in my childhood, one of my trauma responses had always been hyper independent. So I didn't want anybody to teach me or even quote unquote heal me. And now I know that nobody can heal anybody. And there's a whole misnomer around the term healing. And I could talk about that in another context. But it brought me into this space where I wanted to know everything I could about my own psyche, about my own inner world. And that became a really big journey from my late 20s. It's never stopped. I've dove into the depths of shadow work and all of these incredible self-help and psychological understanding and reprogramming and neuro-linguistic stuff and all of this incredible stuff. And that really helped to position me to become a better parent. And even though I didn't have time to be a good parent, I knew the tools in order to be a good parent because of the self-accountability that I had. So my book is a lot of storytelling about that journey, in addition to a lot of scientific research around neurobiology, psychology, biology, all sorts of really deep research to help the parent understand what the adolescent journey is, what they're going through. And a lot of us don't even understand our own journeys, even though we've been through them. And the other part of the book is half the book is filled with tools. And the tools are the tools that I use with teens. In 2020, I founded a practice called transformative mentoring for teens, because in 2020, as you know, the world shut down and teens were like, what am I going to do? This is a time where their brain, biologically, they're individuating and they're wired to step out and explore identities and really, veer towards more social learning. A lot of that was transformed to the online space, which is what you're talking about, which is the influence of social media. And a lot of that came as a result of a collective trauma that we all experienced in 2020. So my book addresses not only the world changes, but the biological changes, and it helps parents to understand how to support their children. However, the best advice in this book is to invite each parent to go through and use the tools themselves. So go through the book, use all the tools yourself and understand your own inner world and
Mm.
become very fluent in the belief systems and in the programming that you are functioning from, in order to start pulling that apart and creating greater accountability for the way that you as the parent are interacting with your child. And then when that is, part of the dialogue, you can facilitate these tools in partnership with your teens. And that helps to create greater connections in our families. Understanding that the world has changed is part of it. And it looks very different from the way the world looked when I was growing up from a social perspective. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure you guys are closer,
Oh,
you're not as close to my age. You're probably 20 years younger than me. And
you're
so,
too kind.
yes, you guys, I'm sure you are.
You're too
But
kind.
I mean, I'll shock your audience. I'm 58, so like I'm getting close to 60 now, and that to me is like a whole nother
Yeah.
world. But what that looks like is you guys grew up with internet. I didn't grow up with internet. So it's very, very different in my world. So I had to become very fluent in the language of
Mm-hmm.
was serving. And, the meme culture and all of this stuff is really fascinating. There's so many wonderful books about that in order to help you to understand. But that doesn't change a person's own understanding of their own inner worlds. And somehow that got erased
Right.
from the conversation. And what this does is it helps bring us back to those spaces where not only do we have to be adaptive to understand that there's this whole other world of social media, social culture, trends that may not be as familiar to us, and pronouns that maybe for your generation it was a little easier because you guys are not in my generation, but I had to adapt to understand where
Mm-hmm.
things came from and how to participate and honor not only my core values, but the core values of the people that I am serving and the core values of the human beings that are this world's future.
Yeah.
And the only way that I can do that is by meeting them where they were without judgment. And by being a parent, meeting somebody where they are without judgment was the
Oh, it
greatest
is hard.
gift or tool that I had to learn to
Yeah.
adapt and practice. And
Yeah.
that's what this book is about.
It's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I'd love to know your thoughts on homeschooling for high school, because there seems to be a very common idea even amongst people who have chosen to homeschool, that when it comes to high school they should transition to school, and part of that is that like social learning, right? So what do you think about that, transitioning to high school?
I think that's a misnomer. I do believe, and I wrote an article about this about 10 years ago, the parents that are, adapting, that are moving out of the homeschooling space to enroll their children into um, traditional schools, primarily for the social aspect. Um, it it is not necessarily so, and what parents have to understand, if you are living a conventional life, there are homeschool teen groups and clubs that you can join, but you don't always have to connect with people of your own age. And that was one of the things that I learned just by being a world schooling parent. My son had friends that were 8 years old and that were in their 70s. Multi-age learning became a rich part of the way that he learned to interact with the world. And as if you are placing your teen back into a conventional situation because you're afraid they're going to miss out on prom or high school, football games or that sort of thing. There
Mhm.
are other alternatives, but as a homeschooling or unschooling parent, it's up to you to find these opportunities, and you must do that in partnership with your teen. So, their experience, their expectation of a traditional high school experience may come from your belief system,
Mm.
right? It may come from the things that you experienced. And if we're looking at the world through the lens of the world is a very, very different place now, we can do whatever we want. We can connect with youth if we want, our community online. We can connect with people from around the world online. There is no reason to be in a geographic place, for what is it, 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week with people in your same geographic location, learning the exact same thing, doing the exact same thing. Life is really meant to be lived in discovering what our individual purpose and passions are and having the freedom to switch and change and explore. You can't do that in a traditional high school setting. So why not figure out what lights up each one of us and find community around that? I know teens that opted, not to go back to school because they were super involved in ballet, or they really loved working with animals and opted to author their own animal rights magazines and work in, with all sorts of people, all sorts of ages at these shelters and things of that nature. I know people that went to homeschool dances in order to have that feeling, or traveled with groups of teens
Hmm.
in order to have that, community connection. In fact, that's one of the businesses that my
Yeah.
son and I launched 13 years ago or 12 years ago, is a company that takes teens to different places around the world in order to have these immersive learning experiences with this deep sense of community.
I love
So,
that. I love
Yes.
that.
opportunities everywhere, and if the social thing is the thing driving you, there are so many different
Yeah.
other options.
And I think as you're talking, and for listeners on our side, I think the big takeaway for me is we're all stuck in a box that's handed down to us, and we tend to peek out of it every now and then, but not strong enough to step out. And then conversations with folks like you show stepping out is not that bad, you know.
Mhm.
It's not
So
that.
I've got two final questions. I know we're getting into the last few minutes. One, if so, the book is really good for parents, but
Yeah.
talk to a teenager. Okay, talk to my daughter. She's 16. The rules are different. Her view on life is different. I struggle because my trauma is working really, really hard because that's how I was judged. So I look at her the same way, but with all the tools that they have at their hands today, working hard is different, right? And so if you're talking to teenagers that listen to this, um, what should they be focusing on as teenagers? Like what characteristics, what skills, what emotional, whatever we want to call it, what do they need to work on? If there's one thing they should work on, what would that be in your opinion? And then the
Yeah.
final question is, um, as you went through your journey with your son, um, were there any moments of doubt? And if there were, how did you crush through that and kept going for the last 15, 18 years?
So what I do, and I know that the prompt was to speak to a teen, but what I do is I create safe spaces that are judgment free to explore the inner worlds. So I don't know, I don't generalize a human being, um, but I love asking them first philosophical questions and poking around and seeing what's in there and allowing space for answers to bloom and blossom, and then asking to go deeper. So that's one amazing point of entry. But what I wish for every adolescent out there is to have the tools to understand their internal worlds. And that comes through self-inquiry. And there's different ways of addressing self-inquiry, what beliefs are there, why are we functioning certain ways. But you can't just prod them as human beings to know those answers without creating the safe spaces. And one of those, entry points is start talking philosophy. What's the purpose of life for you? What lights you up? And the things that, and without judgment, right? The ability to listen, the ability to be the cheerleader for whatever's coming out, and creating ways for them to speak deeper and deeper and deeper allows them to see how uniquely brilliant and capable that they are, right?
I love that.
That's the first thing. And in terms of your second question about doubt, of course, there are always, I hope I'm not ruining my child's life. But
Yep.
when those thoughts came up, they were attached to an emotional state, which in my case was fear, which then brought a whole nother, belief or thought. And let's face it, the brain doesn't know the difference between truth or a fiction. All the brain knows is when you are habitually thinking a thought, right? That gets interpreted by the brain as, oh, well, that must be true. And because I had done so much work about pulling apart what we call truths in our brain and reprogramming those beliefs, I have the tools to be able to say, this is one of my triggers, and this comes from, X, Y, and Z, which I can trace back to my childhood. And when those things came up and got in between my connection or relationship with my son, and let's face it, traveling together for 15 years, just the two of us 24/7, we had to have emotional intelligence. We had to have strong communication, and we had to have the ability to unpack some of these big uncomfortable moments and be accountable. So it wasn't my son's fault that I was fearful. That was part of my programming that I started to unravel, right? And
Wow.
for him, in partnership with me, he got to witness this. And now, as a 25-year-old man, he is so emotionally intelligent and so capable of recognizing when stuff comes up for him in his interpersonal relationships as a result of being raised in this way.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Wow.
So much advice for parents.
Wow.
And it's not just one thing. We're not talking about just education or homeschooling. We're talking about,
Mhm.
the inner worlds. We're talking about, you don't have to leave your home country and travel for 15 years, but understanding that, relationship connection is such a massive part of facilitating another person's education. It becomes your education too. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having
Such a
me.
great spot to end off on. So much good wisdom. And so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And your website is transformativementoringforteens.com.
Yes. And
Where else
Project
people
World
can hit you up?
School. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
We'll tag you everywhere, and we'll be back in touch. Thank you again for
Yeah.
so much interesting knowledge, and I'm sure that people are going to reach out for support, because these are the things that we get all the time, and we're like, where do we direct these things to? And now we have a champion in the ring with us.
Absolutely.
And I'm happy to answer any questions or anything you, other questions you have any other time. And I'm also publicly going to challenge you. I'm going to challenge you both to invite Monroe onto the show because
Oh,
he's
that would be amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, I would love to have him on.
That'll be so awesome. We've yet to have anybody who can talk about the experience. So from a child experience. So yes, count us in. Thank you again. We appreciate your time. We'll link everything below for everybody to come follow. Once again, very, very great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lainie.
That's a wrap. Oh my gosh. We could do like another hour easily. You're so good at breaking it all down, Lainie. Wow.
I appreciate that. I'm a talker, so I should have warned you before. You probably didn't get through half of your questions, so I'm sorry.
No, it's good, man. And we also are learning how to structure these things, because when we speak to our parents, there's the opposite end of like super out of fear, and then the full of the opposite is people that are fully motivated, they're committed already. Now they're on the road trying to figure out on the way what they're going. And so for us, it's just a privilege that these people trust us with a relationship. It started as curriculum. Now it's curriculum is not even the topic of discussion anymore. It's all the other layers, which is really fascinating, as Lindsey and I build this thing together. But this is fantastic. Thank you so much.
My
Maybe we'll do a
pleasure.
contest when we launch this, and we'll buy some of your books and give it away to our folks.
That'd be so lovely.
Yeah, let's do that.
If you're ever interested in like just doing an episode on how to combat fear from an internal world perspective, I can actually facilitate tools that are in my book
Mhm.
in person. That would give people
Yeah.
a chance to kind of like, oh yeah, I really do have this fear, and oh yeah,
Ooh.
I am projecting. I mean, it would be educational, and I don't mind doing that.
Yeah.
It'd
But you
be
know what we
like,
should do now that you planted the seed? I'm the daydreamer guy. Lindsey hates it when I do this. But what if we turn this into a webinar and we give away the books on the
sure,
webinar, invite some parents so that
sure.
they can learn directly from you? But it'll be great to like you're just really good at what you do. It's awesome.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Are
Thank
you
you.
in LA now? Like, is that home base?
No, I'm in Mexico. We live in Mexico now.
That's so awesome. Mainland or an offshoot somewhere?
No, I'm like actually like north of Mexico City.
Oh
So I'm in a
wow.
city called Guanajuato. It's so beautiful here.
You guys still travel, or are you stationary now?
I mean, we're stationary. We happened to be in Mexico when the pandemic hit, and we were, living totally nomadically. And, we just ended up staying. We both got our residency. I mean, we don't live together, but my son lives in this town. Like, we went off to a sports bar last night and pretended to watch the football game because we're not into it. But it was just like a fun, weird thing to do. But yeah, I mean, we're really good friends. We work together, and yeah, here we are. But we do travel. Yeah, we just got back from Thailand.
That's
Cool.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
if I could write a good, not end story, but like a chapter with my kids, it would be if they considered me a good friend. I didn't consider
Yeah,
my parents good friends at all. I was like, they took care of me, they kicked me out, I'm good. But I'm like, as I think about my own kids' journey, I'm like, okay, if 10 years from
awesome.
now, 20 years from now, they want to like hang out with me and they call to go for a drink, that's like success.
Right? I mean, it's about connection. And, I expect to have this connection with my son for the rest of his life. Like, how cool is that?
That's
Like, how
amazing.
cool is
That's
that?
amazing. Well, thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for
I
spending
really
time with us. Okay. See you.
thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thanks.